I spent a couple years at YouTube working on news partnerships. Before that, I was actually consulting YouTube because at the time, YouTube had this marketing strategy where they thought it would be great if they could convince TV news shows to include clips from YouTube on the air. And they were having a really, really hard time convincing news shows to do this. And so I was working with this little firm called Smith Geiger, and we picked up YouTube as a client. And we were working with the marketing team to coordinate their conversations with news organizations to try and put clips on the air. And it was a steep climb at first because of the journalistic considerations that you can all imagine. But over time, I think everyone realized that they didn't care about the journalistic considerations anymore, and so they just started throwing them on the air. And then what happened was, as more news organizations started doing this, they turned around and they asked, well, who do we talk to about making money together at YouTube? And at the time, there wasn't anyone to talk to about making money together. And so I raised my hand and I went through that crazy Google interview process, and about 3 months later ended up running news strategic partnerships for YouTube. And my thesis for that Google interview process, because it's kind of like applying for a master's degree when you try, and at least used to be, was that it may or may not be all Google's fault, but the reality of the situation is that the economic framework that has supported journalism since World War II is eroding rapidly. And we're not replacing it in the digital economy fast enough. Entertainment is finding its way, sports is finding its way, but journalism is not finding an economic framework in that digital economy sufficient to support the operations. And so I was particularly concerned about this because I have a couple kids, and I wonder about the world that they're going to grow up in, and I think that if we don't have reporters out there holding power accountable, what is their situation going to be like? And so I thought if Google could play a more concerted role in establishing an economic framework to support journalism in the digital economy that we manage a large piece of, then that would be good. And so I really wanted to start at YouTube because I was very excited about video from a monetization perspective because of the CPMs of in-stream inventory relative to search and display. And then I got to know the YouTube business, and I realized that wasn't necessarily going to work out in the short term. But I did spend a lot of time working with other parts around Google, particularly on the monetization side. So I spent a lot of time with the guys that work on the DoubleClick side of the company, a lot of time with the folks that are on the channel sales organization. I got really involved with what's going on with Google consumer surveys. I got very familiar with Google News as a platform and how that works from an algorithmic perspective. And I realized that my fundamental interest was economics. And so in that capacity, I needed to find a different role within the company. And so I moved out of YouTube about a year ago into an internal group that does strategic partnerships and global alliances. And so what we do is effectively we manage the overall strategic engagement with a small number of really large companies, and for me it's the media companies. And so major media company interfacing with all aspects of Google, but talking to 10 Googlers and 10 different phone calls, and it's kind of like that Indian proverb where the three guys holding on to a different part of the elephant, and every Googler seems to describe Google differently. And so it was very, very confusing. And so our team basically is tasked with two things. One is mitigating the risks that are inherent in an uncoordinated strategic engagement with major media companies, and then the other is look for opportunities that could be inherent in a coordinated approach to engaging with major media companies. Now for me, within that focus, there's some entertainment and there's some sports focus that I have, but I'm primarily personally interested in the news organizations just because they have the toughest hill to climb from an economic perspective. Now, some of the history, at least from my own perspective, and this is not necessarily like Google's official view on anything. I don't want anyone to misinterpret whatever I say as Google's official view, because we have very few official views. But my own perspective is that from an economic perspective, I saw how news organizations used to be the owners of the vehicle that would allow for advertisers to talk to consumers. They controlled the only mechanism by virtue of communicating with these consumers, and so they put the content on the same vehicle as the inventory, and they never separated it. And then the internet comes along and destroys that. and basically ruins that scarcity variable in that economic framework. They no longer controlled the apparatus required to have a conversation between an advertiser and a consumer. Now with the internet, the advertiser can talk to 1,000 consumers in 1,000 different ways. The consumers can access information in 1,000 different ways. And the inherent scarcity required to put upward pressure on the monetization rate for advertising in a news product just disappeared. And then to compound it, the technology that we were providing to the world to allow them to monetize their digital inventory was really, really simplistic and very elementary. And so, major premium brand media company putting their high quality, awesome, very tough to buy inventory into this open auction would fundamentally erode the value of that inventory and then would have an adverse effect on the inventory of the non-digital platforms by virtue of association. So then that was a bummer, right? Because you saw the monetization rates just plummet and stay there for a long time in this like digital, traditional dollars for digital pennies or dimes, and then now we're worried about mobile and even being worse, was a terrifying thing. And then at the same time, there was no going back. There's no way to reestablish control of the conversation with the consumer. You can only go forward. And so for me, how do we go forward? How can we reestablish a scarcity variable on the economic framework to start putting upward pressure back on the monetization rates? Because at this point, pretty much everybody knows how to get the audience they deserve. Either through social with search engine optimizations, or with social, with search, or with social with engaging with the consumer. There are ways that you can get the audience that you should be getting. But if you're multiplying that audience against a teeny weeny little itty bitty monetization rate, you're still bummed. It doesn't matter how big your audience is. And so how can we affect positive pressure on that monetization rate so that the advertising economy doesn't become basically irrelevant or immaterial in the financial streams of these media companies that are tasked with the job of actually performing journalism in our society? And so I was focused more on that. And on that front, I'm beginning to see some green shoots. And so hence the title of my topic was something like green shoots, opportunities, or I don't know, something about green shoots, because I like the term green shoots. Because the reason I like green shoots is because I don't know yet if the positive signs we're seeing will actually take hold and become trends over time and scale. Yeah, but the green shoots that I'm seeing are interesting. And so one of them is we did a case study on our engagement with the Washington Post, where they engaged with Google to put their inventory into AdX and do something extraordinary for them, which was expose their brand in the context of that exchange. Now, that was a really risky thing for them to do because of the inherent channel conflict with their direct sellers, and so I understood why people didn't want to do that generally. But the Washington Post went for it, and they actually saw advertisers in an exchange environment bidding up the CPMs, buying the reach that you can get in an exchange, targeting that you can get in programmatic buying, but also buying the brand of the Washington Post to the point where the CPMs actually equal their direct sold CPMs, which is an amazing thing because this was programmatic monetization, and so from a profitability perspective, it was significantly more profitable than their direct selling operation. And so then we started asking the question, well, why is it that advertisers in an exchange, in an auction environment, were willing to put that kind of premium down on the recognition of the brand of the Washington Post? And it got me wondering, and I don't know if this is true, but I hope that it might be, and I'm trying to figure out if we can either prove that it is or then make it true if it's not. But what I think might have happened is advertisers were recognizing the inherent value in the brand of the Washington Post, bidding it up, because they have this sense of trusted reputation, they have this sense of trusted relationship with their reader. And that's worth a lot to advertisers. And in fact, that's worth so much that if they know that they're buying that inventory, they'll actually be willing to pay more for it. And then, well, why are they willing to pay more for that trusted relationship? And then I think, well, I mean, they're very known for rigorously adhering to traditional journalistic ethics. And so then I'm beginning to think, is it possible that in the digital economy, there's an actual economic incentive for traditional journalistic ethics? Could it possibly be? And if it is, how cool would that be? Because if you have an economic incentive for a behavior, then you can scale that infinitely. And it's sustainable. And that bodes well. And so that's one of the green shoots that I see. The other green shoot that I see, and there's just two, and I'm looking for others, but the other green shoot that I see is, and I'm like, I'm out. Where's my mic? Just gotta throw it down. But the other one that I see is, it's interesting for me to see companies like BuzzFeed and Vice, at least now, trying to play the role of serious journalist. You know, I'm sure that they'll say it's because they feel like it's the right thing to do, but I'm sure it's the right thing to do is to make more money. And so evidently, in these digital, well, Vice is a little bit, complicated, but in these digital pure plays, they're seeing an economic driver to present themselves as rigorous journalists. That's awesome. And so with those two green shoots, I'm seeing the beginnings of trends that I hope will prove to be a scalable economic framework that supports journalism in the digital economy. Search at YouTube is very similar. You have to pimp the video so that it does something interesting, so that search will know it actually exists in this corpus of content that is so scaled, it's insane. So then the question is, well, how do you pimp the video? Social. So when you upload something to YouTube, it's because you're going to notify your fan base through social platforms that it's there. It'll get an unusual view metric. Search will recognize it, start returning it into search results. So you have this kind of endosymbiotic relationship between search and social as far as trying to develop an audience for any specific video. But you have to be doing this in this asynchronous conversation that you maintain over time. So,
question for you, Dave. You mentioned the green shoot of the Washington Post on the exchange. So they had created some brand value somehow, even though they were selling it on exchange. Is the same green shoot happening for anybody on YouTube? If the Wash Post sold their own inventory on YouTube, they're next to a giant sea of billions of other video views right next to them, bought and sold programmatically. How do they hold their price?
I mean, I think the short answer is it should. It's not yet, but not for any good reason. So there are, YouTube, you have to realize YouTube is a division of Google that in a lot of ways is actually a publisher that works with Google like any other publisher does. And so they don't actually, so the things that YouTube has implemented from the perspective of its ad operations is not like the full Google stack yet. Over time it will, and then I would expect that to be the case. And the reason why is because YouTube is like this vast primordial ocean of content, and only now we're beginning to see land masses forming and kind of rising out of that ooze, and then those land masses will have beachfront property, and then advertisers will want to live on that beachfront property, but it doesn't even exist yet. But it's starting to, and one of the things that I did when I was at YouTube to try and create a landmass for investigative journalism was work with the folks at the Knight Foundation and at CIR to launch iFiles. And the idea behind it was that we needed to create a landmass, like a destination within this huge wasteland of content that is YouTube, and let people know that if you're interested in serious investigative stories and really innovative storytelling about really hard-hitting issues, go to iFiles on YouTube and you'll get something there. And it was a network that we were curating investigative journalism from Al Jazeera and ABC and New York Times and CIR, and that was the idea. It was to actually create a destination location so that we could actually start to form some valuable real estate in what is otherwise a complete disaster as far as finding content that means anything.
Did it work?
Was that?
Did it work?
Yeah, it actually, the views started to grow. I think, the first year was really a learning process in terms of how to work with all these different organizations for that purpose. And we haven't turned on monetization in the ways that I think we will eventually to try and capitalize on that. But in terms of the views that these videos would get, like a New York Times video that was also curated to the iFiles network would get more views than if it was just on the New York Times channel by itself. And that was the case for all of the network, all of the news companies that were involved. But there's still a lot more we need to do. Yeah. So yeah.
So you talked about the potential economic value of being a trusted, ethical, serious news organization. You talked about tactics for YouTube, but do you have any thoughts about how, what that kind of organization should be doing on mobile? A lot of what we're seeing with mobile today isn't very friendly to in-depth reporting,
Right.
at least in the same form. So what should the strategy be?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a product person, and so any opinions that I have as far as mobile product are concerned are totally, probably poorly informed, and not based on any actual experience. And so it's just the pontificating that I get to do because I work for Google, even though I have no relevant experience to speak on the subject. It's one of those crazy phenomenons that we're living in right now. But what the things that I do like about mobile is audio, and also that second screen scenario. And then also, it's funny because one of the things that I'll frequently refer to whenever somebody asks me that question is Circa. Like, I just think, I have spent a lot of time just talking about the content has to fit the container. And I think Circa is an awesome example of that. And when you just think about the story is told in a variety of ways, but however it's told, it has to fit the container that it's being told on. And so I think Circa is an awesome manifestation of that total focus. But then from an advertising and monetization perspective, I think it needs to be done synergistically with other platforms.
Good.
Yeah.
Netflix and iTunes. Right? People are watching 30-minute shows, 2-hour movies.
Yeah.
I don't actually know where the idea comes from that somehow mobile is bad for longer form anything, when the longest form content we make is consumed unedited on mobile devices.
Yeah, there are extraordinary metrics about YouTube consumption on mobile devices, and at the same time, there are some really surprising metrics on the average length of a video that's being watched on YouTube. And in fact, it's changed the definition of what people refer to as long form. It used to be long form at YouTube was anything longer than 5 minutes. And like as of a few months ago, they changed that to anything longer than 10 minutes is now long form. And because the average length of the thing that I love about digital formats is that you're not constrained by the commercial break. You tell the story in the amount of time that it takes to tell it well. And then you just stop, and that's it. And so you can make it at any length you want it to be. And so it doesn't surprise me to see people consuming longer form on a variety of platforms, because as long as the story is worth listening to, they're going to pay attention. It's just, it took a long time to get out of the mindset that the way you tell a story is the length of time that it takes to tell it on a TV broadcast that has commercials to contend with. So, yeah, make the content fit the container. Anything else?
Dave Gehring from Google.
All right, thank you.